The theory of evolution. Over time, things change. Some things change a lot, and some things change a little. But have you ever wondered why things change? Have you ever wondered how things change? Let's talk more about it. Evolution is a theory that scientists have developed to explain how and why living things have changed over time. We know things have changed. That is a fact. But knowing exactly why they have changed is a theory. But we have lots of evidence we can look at. Back in the early 1800s, there was a French biologist named Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. He noticed that plants and animals tended to change over time. He believed this occurred due to things happening in nature and the environment around them. Although Lamarck was correct, he did not really understand why this was happening, but it opened the door for future scientists to figure it out. It was really Charles Darwin in 1859 who realized that some animals were better at surviving in certain conditions than others. Darwin came up with a theory of natural selection. This theory believed that the strongest would survive and thus have more offspring. The offspring of these stronger individuals would be just like their parents. They too would be able to survive and have more offspring themselves. Eventually, due to a limited amount of food and resources, only the strongest species would survive and the weaker ones would die off. Darwin eventually wrote a book on the origin of species, explaining what he felt to be true. Although his observations were correct, he did not understand the real reason why this was happening. It would be Gregor Mendel, who came shortly after Darwin, who would be the first to understand that there were certain traits being passed down to the offspring. These traits were actually small bits of information he learned were genes. And the genes, we later learned, were made up of specific material called DNA. Where Darwin thought the traits from the mother and father simply got mixed together, Mendel learned these traits actually remained separate and could pass down to the next generation unchanged. So why is any of this really important, and why should we care? We should care because changes we are making to the environment today are affecting the way various plants and animals are changing in order to survive. Short-term changes plants and animals make to survive is called adaptation. Over time, those adaptations can lead to actual changes in the genetic makeup and is called evolution. Let's look at an example back from the time of the Industrial Revolution in the late 1700s. Prior to this time, there were very few factories. There was also a moth called the peppered moth. The peppered moth lived in the forest. It was light-colored with black spots. It was the perfect color to blend in or be camouflaged by the bark of a birch tree. Birds, which loved to eat the peppered moth, would fly right by and not even see them hiding on the tree trunk. But when the factories were built, a lot of soot was released into the air. So much soot, in fact, that everything started turning black, even the trees. They were covered with the soot. Now, the whitish moths stood out on the tree trunk. The birds could easily spot them and eat them right off the tree. But every once in a while, there would be a dark-colored peppered moth. These darker moths would be hidden by the soot. The birds could not see them, so they survived. Over time, the only peppered moths left were those that were darker. The moth had changed or evolved to survive in this new environment. So it might make you stop and wonder what things we are doing now to the environment that is causing plants and animals to have to adapt in order to survive. Let's talk a little more about what we know about evolution and how things change. Sometimes, when a plant or animal is put into a new environment, it has to change so much in order to survive, it actually becomes a new species. For example, when rabbits eventually found their way into the colder, snow-covered regions, they needed to adapt in order to survive. Their brown fur stood out in the white snow, so those rabbits that happened to be lighter colored were more likely to survive. Also, moving on the snow was not as easy as moving on grassy land. Rabbits with wider feet could move faster and get away from predators. It took a long time, but eventually a new species of rabbit evolved, one with white fur and wider feet. This process of one species becoming an entirely new species due to a change in the environment is called speciation. You may wonder how these changes actually occur. We already talked about the traits that are passed down from one generation to the next are made up of small bits or codes of information called DNA. Sometimes when the DNA is passed on, mistakes, often small ones, are made. This is called a mutation. Mutations sometimes result in a good change, like the white fur in the rabbit. Some mutations can be not so good. But over time, these mutations can result in major changes. Every once in a while, these mutations result in a good change that after time is no longer needed. For example, some bugs and birds have wings but are not able to fly. At one time, being able to fly was important in order to survive, but as the world changed, being able to fly no longer mattered. So the wings got smaller and smaller until they no longer worked. This is known as a vestigial structure. A vestigial structure is a part of the animal or plant that seems to serve no purpose, but likely did at one time. Did you know we have vestigial structures? Our appendix and wisdom teeth are both examples. They are things we used to need to chew and digest our food, but today are no longer needed. Let's look one more time at how plants and animals can change. We talked about natural selection. Natural selection occurs when those plants and animals best suited for the environment survive, just like the peppered moth. These plants and animals often use things like camouflage or blending into their surroundings. This way, predators cannot find them or eat them. Sometimes they use something called mimicry. This is when a plant or animal evolves into something that looks just like a different plant or animal. That way, when the predator comes along, it does not know which one to eat. Mimicry is most often seen in the insect world. One of these butterflies would be yummy for a bird to eat, and one would taste terrible. If you were a bird, would you be willing to risk it? There is one other form of selection that occurs over time, and it is artificial selection. Artificial selection most often occurs when either scientists or breeders are trying to change the way something looks or grows. Perhaps a farmer only wants to grow corn with big, fat kernels. Somewhere in a laboratory, a scientist is carefully mixing different corn species in order to get one that has the biggest and fattest kernels. This is not happening in the natural environment. It is something man is forcing to happen. Artificial selection has led to some amazing discoveries, but it has to be carefully controlled and monitored. Evolution is a process no one can stop from happening. It is a natural process and allows the strongest to survive. But we certainly need to think about the effect we have on the world and the environment, because sometimes plants and animals cannot adapt or evolve fast enough, and they actually disappear forever. When a plant or animal becomes extinct, it is forever gone from the earth. Sometimes it happens naturally, like dinosaurs, but more often than not, it is something that we have done to the earth. So, we need to be careful and take care of our earth. Once it is gone, we will never get it back.